My guest today is Adrian Murdoch, who has written the book Rome's Greatest Defeat and several other books on Roman history. And today we're going to talk about the Battle of Teutoburg first, which infamously is known as what stopped the Roman expansion into Germany. And we are of course going to debate this a little bit at the end of the episode. Was this truly what stopped the Romans from expanding into Germany? But first, I want to begin with what got you interested in Roman history in the first place?
Thanks so much for having me on the show. Um, I was interested and obsessed with the Romans from a very, very early age. I Asterix, I suspect, is,
Hmm.
is 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 what really got me into it. I remember my grandfather had a pretty much complete set of Asterix, and I used to enjoy running over to his and looking at the books as soon as I turned up. And I studied it from a very early age. I was lucky enough to do Latin at primary school, continued through secondary school, and ended up studying Roman history at university. It wasn't something I could really escape.
Hmm. And of course, the Romans were essentially Britain as well, so it's part of British history as well.
And especially up here. I mean, I'm based in Scotland,
Hmm.
pretty much on the Antonine Wall itself. If I were to look out of the window now, I can, in the distance, still see the mound of the Antonine Wall. It's a very visible presence to Rome.
So as you know, let's begin with the Roman expansion. As they conquered Gaul with Caesar, and they of course tried to expand further into Germany. But what was relations with German and Roman tribes and the Roman Empire at this time? We don't bit in right around 9 AD.
You need to put it into the context of what it was that Rome was trying to do. This was the age of Augustus. Augustus was expanding the empire like nobody's business. He was making it sort of broader, deeper. He was being egged on by the poets. He was being egged on by politicians to push further than it had ever gone before. And so he went initially into following Julius Caesar, and followed up the campaigns in Gaul. At that stage, they were aware of Germany and they were aware of something over there. Caesar had done a couple of, I think, exploratory is probably the best way of putting it, raids into Germany, but nothing really had happened. One of the difficulties that we have is that you and I discussing this now will describe it as French and German. Of course, that didn't exist at the time. So Gaul went sort of right up to the Rhine.
Hmm.
Um, and the Romans were aware of the other side of the Rhine. They were starting to trade with the other side, and it's sort of, as we move into the into this period ahead of Teutoburg, you're starting to see genuine trade. It was working both ways. And you can get a sense of what was being traded. I mean, first of all, men. There was a big trade of slavery from the Germans to the Romans. I mean, it's easy enough to see what the Germans wanted from Rome. You know, if you look into any graves of the period, you see weaponry, you see wine sets, you see effectively the bits and pieces of civilization. But the trade worked the other way as well, and I find that really, really interesting. So there was a tradition up until Nero, at least, that the emperor's personal bodyguards were German. They were regarded as taller, fitter, um, uh, more manly, more violent, better protectors of the Roman imperial self. But you can see other sort of bits and pieces going as well. I mean, we know from sort of linguistically that geese were also traded into the Roman Empire. And you can start to see at as we head towards sort of 1 AD, there were farms. There was a genuine exchange of goods. You can see German farms far bigger than just being, enough to feed the family or that broader community. They were clearly they had animals for export as well. But relations were not great. There had been something called the Lollius Gate in modern language in about 18 BC, where the Germans killed a legate, and there was a lot of back and forth at the time. The Roman army was being pushed more and more into Germany. It wanted to try and civilize what it saw as barbarians. Now, there was a huge economic drive to this as well. The Romans realized that the more people paying taxes, the more money that there would be for the exchequer in Rome. It was a fairly significant drive. But as we head towards 9 AD, we have the problem that the Roman Empire, was slightly deluding itself, for want of a better word. The news was being broken that Germany is more or less now conquered. It's now part of the empire. There are some particularly impressive archaeological digs from the late 90s onwards, which show that the Romans were trying to build cities. I mean, not just walled camps, but proper cities, communities. There was a forum built in what is now Hessen. So this was more than just a basic camp. And so the Romans thought that, we've built all this, we've shown them, if you want to put it crudely, we've shown these Germans central heating, and we've shown them our
way of life.
Way of life in town halls. Why would anybody not want to have that? But as became very, very clear at Teutoburg, the Germans weren't remotely as, in inverted commas, civilized as the Romans would like to believe, and that they wanted to get rid of this.
So let's begin with the Germans. Look at the German side and how the Germans worked, because there were several tribes. They weren't united, much like the Gauls were. And I gotta ask, of course, Tacitus wrote his famous book on which is called Barbarians, or about the German people. How accurately, I imagine not very, because he's not Roman and he's biased, but how well does he describe the Germans?
That's a very, very good question. I mean, his German book on Germany, there is a good case to be made that few books have caused as much damage with as few words. It is only 25 pages long, which is the same length as Mao's Little Red Book. And one can certainly make a case that that it has sort of causes many problems. I think it's unfair to describe it as biased. Yes, it was to an extent, and he was describing politics, and he had a certain agenda, but he was also writing history through his own prism. So he was writing as a Roman, trying to understand these things. It's very easy to call that bias. One could also say, he wasn't able to interpret it properly.
where did he get his sources from? Was it Roman soldiers who'd been to Germania at the time, or did it even
Absolutely.
from Germans in themselves?
Both. There was a lot of engagement back and forward. Partly by that stage, a good number of histories had been written about Germany. One of the sort of great regrets, every classicist has their great regret of, which book do they wish had survived. And Pliny the Elder's history of Germany, which hasn't survived at all. I think a few quotations have survived. I really wish that were around. So it was fairly well known. Bear in mind that by the time of Teutoburg, Germany had been known for about 50 years. There'd been considerable trade back and forward. I mean, as I said, the Romans were starting to civilize, and there was engagement both ways. There were there are graves of tombstones of Roman soldiers who had settled themselves in Germany after they'd done their military service, and they were clearly working as import-export businessmen, bringing stuff back. So there was a lot of dialogue. People didn't know it necessarily in detail, but they had an idea of roughly the size, where it was, what was going on. It wasn't terra incognita by any means.
Let's speak about Arminius' tribe
Yep.
and his upbringing, because that was that a prestigious tribe, or what? How were they trading well with the Romans? What was their relations with the Roman like?
They were actually pretty tightly connected to the Romans, and that is one of the problems. Arminius himself was from the tribe of the Cherusci, which is roughly around where the town of Hanover is today. It wasn't one of the biggest, but it was quite well known. The tribe had fairly good connections with Rome. Let's remember, Arminius himself could speak Latin, so was able to communicate, and had been in the Roman army, was stationed and had been promoted within the Roman army for quite a while. And his brother, Flavus, we don't even know his brother's Germanic name. I mean, he was called Flavus. Remained loyal to Rome and worked with Rome all the way through. But the story of Arminius becomes very interesting because it's almost a micro view of what one can guess the relationship with Rome was across all of the tribes. You can see within the tribe that there were some people. So Arminius's father-in-law, Segestes, was very pro-Rome. He saw the advantages. He wanted to do it. Arminius had become, we're not entirely sure why exactly this happened, very much against Rome. And there was another senior leader, Ingiomerus, who was occasionally pro-Rome and occasionally against Rome. And what we see from this is the tribes weren't either pro or against. There was no uniformity to this. Some of the leaders saw some benefit to Rome, some saw against it, and Arminius himself knew Rome. I mean, this was the problem. He knew how Romans thought. He knew how Romans fought. He could see Germany from their perspective, as it were, and this is what he was rejecting.
And I want to go back because you mentioned Arminius and growing up in Rome, because as you know, his father sent his boys away kind of as a taxation. I would compare this to later Janissaries who were sent away to be trained, and they were going to be brought up in Rome, and they were going to come back and hopefully, which kind of backfired in this case, have good relations with Rome, be kind of a puppet for Rome when they came back, which I believe was their idea with this. So let's talk about Arminius and Flavius' upbringing in Rome.
Yeah.
when they come there as children.
The being brought up in Rome itself is an incredibly clever bit of diplomacy from the Roman point of view, because of course they had the leaders and they had them very, very close, and you're not going to get tribes mucking around if all of the sons are in Rome. But more to the point, it was psychological and it was long-term thinking on behalf of Rome that these people were being trained, they were being brought up as Roman. As I said, they were speaking Latin, they understood Roman technology, they understood Roman battles. They were becoming insiders. The psychology was, they're now one of us. They're being taught this way. And Arminius, we don't know, but we can extrapolate. We suspect that he fought fairly well in the Roman army. In the Pannonian campaigns, this was the uprising in Pannonia. It was the biggest uprising to hit the Roman Empire before Germany kicked off in a particularly unpleasant way. And the reason that we can presume that Arminius did well is that he was sent back home afterwards. The Romans clearly thought, we've done our job, we've taught him well. He can now effectively act as our mouthpiece within Germany.
So let's talk about his capture who he was brought under, because Varus, I believe, he was the one who was kind of like his father in Rome, wasn't he? So let's talk about Varus for a bit, and how he was stationed as the governor on the border of Germany.
There are more myths about Varus than you could possibly imagine. He is portrayed generally as a bumbling idiot. One of the more recent cartoons that was done for the Calcrease Museum has this massively obese, overweight man sitting on a donkey riding along. He's made to look ridiculous. Varus was, and we keep forgetting this, probably one of the smartest politicians and soldiers of his time. He was an incredibly bright man. He had performed very well. He was trusted by the emperors, by Augustus, and he was a close friend of Tiberius, and had done incredibly well. Germany was his third posting. His first posting was North Africa, Carthage. Now, North Africa was an incredibly important province to give to anybody. You didn't give this to just any aristocrat who was knocking around. You gave it to somebody that you trusted, partly because you had a legion, whoever commanded that had a legion at their hands. But much more importantly, it was the breadbasket of Rome. It was one of the major breadbaskets along with Egypt. So whoever controlled North Africa essentially controlled all the bread going to Italy. So you only gave that to people that you trusted really, really, really well. And he was trusted. I mean, his first wife, we don't know much about his first wife, other than that we presume that she existed. But his second wife, Vipsania, was made him the brother-in-law of Tiberius. So he was the brother-in-law of the heir to the throne. I mean, that brought him fairly tightly into the imperial family. And then his second wife, Claudia Pulcher, was also very, very tightly bound up to the family, and that also made him his wife's aunt was Agrippina, who was the wife of Drusus, who had had a lot of experience in Germany as well.
This is, of course, Adrian the Elder.
Correct. But his second posting was also difficult. Varus's second posting was to Syria. And to be thrown into the Middle East, which was famous for, rebellions and religious extremists, it was a very, very difficult position.
So not much has changed in the last 2,000 years.
Yeah, nothing changed at all. It's one of the strange ways the story keeps coming back, because yes, it's very similar. He was described by sources that were hostile to him as particularly brutal in the region. He wasn't especially. I mean, by modern standards, of course, his behavior was brutal. He put down a rebellion. He crucified people and hung their bodies up on the roads and so on. But again, to put it into perspective, it was fewer people than had happened under the when Spartacus was caught and the slaves were put out. So he was doing no more than it was expected of him. But obviously, we could debate how we as modern historians see it. He was seen as a successful man by the Romans. Now, to be then given Germany, that was another sign of, this is a man who knows what he's doing. He's good at dealing with rebellions, and he's good at putting a province back together again. There'd been a lot of warfare in Germany. It had been slightly chaotic. There was the unmitigated disaster of Drusus, who was the histories describe him, or rather contemporary historians describe him as, one of the great successes of the Roman world. He was an absolute disaster, who caused chaos with the legions, and you needed a strong ruler to calm everything down, and to make it civilized again. And that's what he did. I mean, certainly for the first couple of years that he was there, he was doing what they wanted him to do, which was turn Germany increasingly into a province as Romans would recognize it. So he wasn't this idiot of history. Now, we can talk about the mistakes that he made, and he certainly made mistakes. Almost certainly he misunderstood his relationship with Arminius, who had been one of a number of people he had fairly close to him and who he was relying on. But this idea that the Varus was an idiot from the beginning, we can scratch that.
Was he respected among his fellow soldiers, or was he like, kind of like, he's just our leader, was he beloved, or was just respected by his soldiers?
It is always difficult to say, because no one was going to defend him after he lost. I mean, this idea of the glorious defeat that we see these days, that didn't exist. So you're going to be very hard pressed to find anybody to say anything nice about him after his disastrous battle. But he seems to have done pretty well. There were no signs of disaster. Pardon me. There were no signs of disaster. The place was beginning to turn into a province. He was doing well by all accounts, and the battle itself, again, it shouldn't be forgotten. It was an ambush, in the sense that Varus was pretty much doing what he was expected to be doing. They had campaigned all year. He was moving everything back to camp, and by everything I mean soldiers, but along with it all of the paraphernalia that goes along with any army. So it was all the servicemen who went along with it. It was the Romans who had serviced the soldiers when they were in Germany. It would have been girlfriends coming back as well. It would have been prostitutes coming back. It was every element of Roman society. Effectively, the cities were moving back to we're moving back to Roman territory for the winter.
We talked about some of the main players now to
Yeah.
build up to the battle itself, of course, and I feel like this is necessary in order to understand
Yeah.
how things developed here. But let's talk about Armenians coming back to Germany. Do we know if there was some emotions there? They lost emotions, and how was he received by his tribe when he came back? Do we know this?
Again, it's very, very difficult to say, partly because we don't have any contemporary historians from the time. Sorry, Germanic historians, I mean. And a lot of the history that we have was used as an excuse effectively to beat up Varus for having caused this disaster. I mean, everybody wanted to make sure that he had the blame for it. But presumably he was well regarded when he came back. He became commander of and the chief of the Cheruscan tribe fairly rapidly. And he had enough personal sway to be able to be head of the tribe, but clearly there have been conversations saying we're now going to go against Rome. And while we can look around and say, okay, it's overstated how many tribes joined him beforehand, we can make an estimate that 3 or 4 tribes properly joined him in advance. It was different as soon as it looked as though he was winning. Considerably more Germanic tribes joined him, because obviously you want to be on the side of the winner. But he had clearly made a name for himself and was well regarded.
Do we know why he suddenly switched side? Was it for personal benefits, or was it like he generally detested Rome and he never felt at home belonging there, and he just needed? Was it for his own personal prestige, in other words, or was it just for go against Rome for glory of his people?
That's the $1 million question, and I'm sure you can imagine how many pages have been written trying to work out. We don't know is the simple answer, and even more broadly than that, we don't know what it was that he was trying to do. I suspect that it wasn't quite as thought out as it was. I mean, from the 18th and 19th, from the rise of nationalism in Germany in the 18th and 19th century, and then the 20th century, he wanted to unite this pure race and kick out these southern upstarts who were taking over the promised land of Germany. Of course, that was nonsense, because almost none of those concepts existed. I think it was more prosaic than that. He didn't want to pay taxes. If you normally want to look at reasons for doing something, it's always good to look at where the cash is. And they didn't want to pay taxes. They were being forced to send make produce either directly or in kind, and send to Rome, and this was annoying them. As for Arminius himself and his own motivations, I think it's safer not to try and give an answer, because there isn't one. We don't know. I mean, he was against Rome and he wanted to get rid of Rome. But beyond that, we don't really know.
So let's talk, before we go into United Tribes, to spoke briefly about. I want to talk about his marriage with another heroine, I believe, of Germany, which is Tusnelda, who was, as you mentioned, the daughter of such justice. So was
Yeah.
this a strategic alliance for Arminius to marry to Stella?
Again, this is one of those questions that we'd love to answer, and
There's a lot of those in there.
we don't know. There is a massive Germanic tradition, again from the 18th and 19th century, that it was a love match. It could well have been a love match. We simply don't know. We know that they were married. We know that they had a child, a son, Thermelicus. After the battle, a couple of years after the battle, she was captured by Germanicus and sent to Ravenna in Italy, which seemed to be the dumping ground for everyone that the Romans wanted to keep alive but didn't want to kill. But of their relationship itself, we don't know. I mean, there are some marvelous plays. German plays in the 19th century, which have her as she was the political thinker for Arminius, and that he's portrayed as the muscle, and she was the brain who provoked him, if that's the right way of putting it, to invade Rome. But not to invade Rome, but to get rid of all the Romans. But we simply don't know.
So let's talk about how did it manage to convince uniting the tribe to go against Rome? Because as you mentioned, they were not united at all, much like Gaul was. What did they hope to be? Like kind of like I don't forget his name, but the guy, the Gaulish leader who united the tribes against Caesar.
Vercingetorix.
Vercingetorix, that's it. It was on the tip of my tongue there. But was it hoping to be kind of that kind of figure for the Germans?
He has become that afterwards, and again, that's how he was portrayed from the 18th century onwards. I'm a bit more skeptical. Only 3 or 4 tribes joined Arminius to begin with, and I can guess, we can guess that his pitch was something along the lines of, "I don't want to pay tax. You don't want to pay taxes either. If we get rid of them, we might get some booty, and then we'll be left alone."
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's enough.
Yeah. That's a very, very good point, because one thing that is ignored, and simply because we don't have enough evidence about it, is there was very little. There's very little history that we can talk about of the relationship.
And that is a shame, because it's such a fascinating and gigantic battle in history that we don't have so much evidence to gather from. It should have been, you think, because it's significant, at least in later centuries, that it should be more written about this, and it's such a shame that it isn't.
That is one of the more interesting things about it. I mean, as I said earlier, there was no cult in Rome of the glorious loser. You very, very rarely get. You had Leonidas at the Battle of Marathon, but pretty much, the Romans didn't celebrate losses. Only a handful of people wrote about the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. You had a chap called Paterculus, who is significant because he was the closest. He knew all of the people involved, and he wrote soon afterwards. The only problem is he was an absolutely dire writer. His Roman history did survive, and it was used as a kind of grammar lesson in the 16th, 17th century. But his Latin is dreadful, and he's not much of a historian. But you're then getting on to people like Tacitus and Cassius Dio, and they were all writing significantly after the event. Now, to an extent, they were using some writers at the time, but when you're that far removed, it becomes difficult to do.
And I've been postponing a little bit to talk about this, and I know this is what people came to the episode for, and then let's talk about the battle itself.
Yeah. I think the crucial thing to remember about the battle, and is often forgotten, is that there was no Battle of Teutoburg Forest.
Hmm.
It was an extended series of skirmishes that probably went over around 50, 60 kilometers. The best analogy that I've seen to it is if you look at the battles with the German soldiers in Europe at the end of the Second World War, that comes close. So there were lots of skirmishes as people kept retreating. And that, I suspect, is what the Battle of Teutoburg Forest itself was. It was a series of skirmishes. And Calcresa, where the museum is, was one of the main points and one of those main skirmishes. But this wasn't something that happened in a field. And that's what's made it so hard to discover and to see.
Let's talk about the route that the Varus had to take. Was this the
Yeah.
best possible options for the Roman army to go through? Or did you have better option? Perhaps, or was it just reluctant, not reluctant, but insistent on going? We're going that way. That's final. Nothing gonna happen to us. Armenius is our friend. He's not gonna let anything happen to us. Or was there other options he could have taken to avoid this disaster?
I'm afraid I'm going to annoy you again because we don't know.
Hmm.
The best guess is that it was going from west to east. The best guess is that Arminius and the tribes that he had worked with had they wanted to create something that would cause the Roman army to divert. Now, that is one of the cleverest things that Arminius did, because it couldn't be so large that that Varus would say, right, I'm going to send out dispatches, I'm going to get help from all the other Roman legions in Germania, or even get legions from outside the country. It had to be an uprising that was small enough that Varus thought, I can deal with this now, but not too big. That either, if it was too small, he might just send some small troops. If it was too big, he'd call for reinforcements. It had to be something that he would do himself. And in this, Arminius judged it perfectly. Again, we don't know exactly what it was. The best guess is there is a tribe in the region called the Angrivari, and an uprising in that tribe would have been enough to kick things off. So that's what we think happened. And the Roman army was coming south, and then headed west towards those. Again, this is a streak of utter genius from Arminius, was that he used the landscape perfectly. It's quite hard to see in modern times how it works, but some of the digs down to the Roman level at Calcresa, where the battle is, give an indication of what he did. He funneled the Romans onto probably a 200-meter wide stretch. So they would be walking quite closely together. The cavalry wouldn't be able to deploy properly. They obviously wouldn't be able to get the siege weapons out properly. It's been called a lobster pot. It was a way of tracking the Romans in, but they wouldn't be able to get out properly. A lot of thought had clearly gone into this. This wasn't an ambush that happened on the spur of the moment. You can see at Calcresa itself, the Germanic tribes had built or built up barricades of earth, so they could attack the Romans who would be thrown into sort of disarray while remaining slightly protected. It was a very, very clever move, but it was about 3 or 4 days worth of battles. What is also significant is that the weather really, really, really played to Arminius's strengths. For years, it had been thought that discussions of the rain and the storms were literary rather than they were metaphors for the problems that were hitting the Romans rather than literal. But anybody who knows northern Germany at that time of year knows quite how unpleasant the weather is and can be in those sudden North Sea storms which can come over. Did a fantastic job for the Germans of neutralizing the Romans. Asynchronous warfare has become the thing that is talked about in military circles, which is when a technologically inferior army completely defeats a much more technologically advanced army. And this has always been the discussion about Teutoburg Forest. And I suppose the best parallel, and the one I've sort of written about most, is with the Vietnam War. That the Germans, on paper, did not have the military equipment that the Roman army had. But what they did was find a way of getting the Romans to fight in a stupid manner. And that's exactly what the Viet Cong did in Vietnam. And many of the techniques were the same. It was the sudden ambushes. It was the appearing into the forest, causing mayhem, and then vanishing again almost before the American soldiers had their trousers on. The weather certainly helped. In the sense that the leather for the Roman army will have become incredibly heavy, and if you're a soldier, you're tired, you haven't slept properly, you've been harried at night, and your shield suddenly weighs twice as much as it was going to weigh, because it's been soaked. Psychologically, that's an incredible thing to do. And the narrowness of the paths, I think I said a minute ago that it caused the Romans to fight slightly stupidly. Obviously, if they were in an open plain, the cavalry could have taken out the German army in seconds.
And let's not forget that the Romans are mostly trained for open pitch battles, not in close, not a close, tight forest situation as they find themselves in Teutoburg forest.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. And they couldn't deploy the horses. Now, if you are traveling with a lot of horses but can't actually use them in any way, they are just getting in the way. And more to the point, if somebody is firing arrows at those horses, you suddenly have a huge problem that you can't physically get out, can't get around. It's it was a very canny move on the part of Arminius, and constantly harassing them, constantly harassing the Roman army so that they had no break, was also a very, very smart move. The ordinance that the Germanic tribes had was again stood to their favor. I have sort of written about in the past the German tribes were described as having fought nudus, which used to be described as nude. The German soldiers sort of running around naked with spears. That's of course nonsense. And nudus could also just mean lightly armed. And I'm pretty sure that the Germans were wearing trousers, but
which is barbaric.
Yeah, exactly. But what that meant is, by being lightly armed, they had their spears. They possibly had a sword for close combat, They had these very light wicker shields, but it meant that the Germans could suddenly appear from the forest, cause damage, but then vanish again very quickly.
So let's talk about the main skirmishes you mentioned on the location of the museum and Varus' suicide, which that loss would eventually lead to.
Yeah. The battle, the main sort of crux of the battle seems to have happened there. The Roman army by that stage had been attacked for 3 or 4 days. Clearly a lot of damage had been done. Pneumonius Valor, who was the head of the cavalry, tried to escape off to the south. He gets a bit of a bad rap in the Roman writing. You know, the man was deserting his army. But there's also the fairly plausible explanation that he was asked to leave, and at the at the site of the battle itself, there are a couple of statues of horses, which sort of indicate possibly the direction they went. And anyway, none of the cavalry survived. So the Roman army had been cut down dramatically. One of the most poignant parts of the battle, and that brings home how scary it was, is I described earlier the ramparts from which the Germans fought. One of them landed on the body of one of the donkeys, the pack animals. Oof. And when archaeologists discovered the bell that was round the animal's neck, the bell had been stuffed with grasses to stop it making a noise. And I think that's a fairly good indication of how scared the soldiers were of what was happening. So I don't think you're extrapolating too far to say, look, they hadn't slept for 3 days. They'd been attacked all the time. They'd lost the cavalry that had gone off. They were on their own. The suicide of Varus, again, should not be seen in contemporary language. It should be seen in the course of its time.
It was kind of like, in a sense, what the Japanese generals did,
yeah,
and when they lost in the Second World War.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. It was not seen as there were cowardly ways to commit suicide, and there were honorable ways, and killing yourself, falling on your sword, was an honorable way of doing it. Now, people tried to write unfavorably about Varus, because of course they did, that he required one of his servants to help him do so. It's also worth pointing out that Varus's father had also committed suicide.
Kind of run in the family.
Well, exactly. It's hard not to make that analogy. I mean, his father had been one of the most unlucky soldiers of all time in the generation previously. He backed everybody who lost. So he backed Pompey against Caesar, and then he decided to go up against Mark Antony, supporting Cicero, supporting Brutus and Cassius, and realizing that he was unlikely to be forgiven for doing this twice.
And that shouldn't have helped the Varus case in history as well.
No, so there was clearly something there. But it's also to be remembered, and I appreciate I keep saying things that need to be remembered, but they would not have expected any sympathy from the Germanic tribes. Partly there was this long historic fear of what German tribes would do to you, and there were these horror stories. The problem was that the horror stories were fairly accurate. there is a survivor's story, not a survivor's story. One of the survivors mentioned that one of the centurions took his arms were tied up with chains and brought the chains down on his own head rather than be killed by the Germans, because it would have been such a brutal way of doing so. And even allowing for the exaggeration of the Roman historians, the Germans were making up for a lot of aggression against them, and they wouldn't have expected any mercy.
And again, I want to make an analogy. We've done this a few times in the Second World War, when the Soviet soldiers enters Berlin, and when we're going to make an episode about this fairly soon, actually.
Oh,
but
fantastic.
you know, how they reacted to the Germans when they invaded Soviet Union, they kind of reacted in the same way. They had a lot of anger to take out on the Germans, and same it was this case, except it was the Germans, not against the Soviet, but against the Romans.
Actually, that's a very good point. And again, this isn't discussed a great deal, but you can imagine. Actually, you don't need to imagine. It is easy enough to see how unsympathetic the Romans will have been for the previous two generations within Germany. There is a lovely letter. It's from the other side of the empire and several centuries later, but a man doing his accounts, and within the accounts is a vast amount of money, bribery to local soldiers. And okay, this was several centuries earlier and in Germany, not in Syria, but I'm pretty sure that as always, the Roman soldiers would have turned up in a local community and behaved, abysmally in the way that occupying forces often do.
So let's talk about, before we go to the aftermath and Germanicus' entrance into the aftermath of the Teutoburg first, because there has been some debate for some time before archaeological evidence, I believe, managed to locate the location of the Teutoburg first. So how difficult was it to find the actual location where this battle took place before, especially before archaeology played a significant part in finding the Teutoburg first? And when did we finally find the location?
It was both easy and incredibly difficult. It's one of those things that, in retrospect, why didn't they find it earlier? It was found by a British soldier who was into archaeology, who went looking in a field called the Golden Field, and it was called the Golden Field because they kept finding Roman coins there. And this was in the 80s. A man, Major Tony Clun, who sadly passed away about a decade ago, was the man who found what is Teutoburg Forest. Now, he wasn't initially looking for the battle itself. He was a what's the word? A metal detectorist, who was just looking for Roman coins. But the battle itself had become a touch point, and I think it's worth digressing for a minute to talk about how the battle occurred. It had vanished almost from history until about the 15th century. There are a few mentions in this, that, and the other, but it was in the 15th century that there was the big discovery of Roman manuscripts in the abbeys around Europe. And the significant one here was, as we said right at the very beginning, Germania, Tacitus's book, which was found in 1455. Didn't really come into notice until the end of the century, so the late 15th century. But it's hard to underestimate what a bomb that set off. it had always been presumed that Germany was part of the Roman Empire. They saw Trier and the very, very visible parts that were there, and other parts of the empire where it was very, very obvious. So it was just presumed that Germany was part of it. And suddenly you have a book which says Germany wasn't invaded and Germany stood proud against the Roman Empire, which instantly, okay, it remained Latin and within the sort of academic upper crust sphere for a while, but it was eventually translated into German, local languages, and it then took off. It was a hugely, hugely, hugely important battle very rapidly. Martin Luther, for example, cited it when he was sort of introducing the idea of Protestantism. Modern historians like Niall Ferguson have suggested that it shows the split between Protestant Europe and Catholic Europe, which brought in sort of all kinds of sort of additional controversy and tension to it. It was used as, we're Protestant, we're Germanic, we're against the soft South. And you can even see the same language, the Euro crisis that we saw in 2008. That kind of language began to come back with the split between, Northern Protestant Europe and what became known as Club Med Europe.
And of course, you have nationalism, where this battle, presumably, played a significant part.
That's where I was going. There was no Germany at the time, obviously, but the battle became the first consciousness of a Germanness that existed. It emerged particularly after the time of Napoleon, as a way of unifying the country. Frederick the Great saw himself as the heir to this. You see it with the Hermannsdenkmal in Detmold, this massive statue, which emerged in the 19th century. It was roughly the same time as we were just talking about. The Vercingetorix began to emerge as the savior of France, and the Boadicea emerged in the UK as fighting against the fight of Rome. But the nuances with Arminius became more significant, because he truly became part of the German consciousness after the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. The huge statue, and a Bandel statue, went up, and I think in about 1875. And it's interesting, the figure which is standing on top with this sword. The sword isn't pointing towards Rome; it's pointing towards France. And he had by that time become a very, very, very strong voice of German nationalism. It continued to reach its not peak, but it was used throughout the Nazi period. Again, it became a useful thing for the Nazis to hold on to. So in the marches in Munich in the mid-30s, they would often have Cheruscan warriors marching alongside, maidens in dirndls and all the other bits and pieces. Hitler himself, in several of his conversations, mentioned it. This isn't to state it, because I mean the idea of a Nazi thought, I mean everything was about power, and there was no sort of unified Nazi thought, but it became involved in that. There was a film in the mid-30s as well which had this idea of Arminius is bringing our great nation together, and we're able to do this. But the reason I've gone on about that is that's one of the reasons why the battlefield was never found. There were huge numbers of archaeologists, and there were huge numbers of early Germanic specialists. Many died during the Second World War. And after 1945, no one within Germany was rushing to start talking about German nationalism again. It's significant that I think only 2 exhibitions in Germany about the early Germanic tribes happened between about 1945 and the end of the century. It's not a thing that people came about. So Tony Clun was able to explore in comparative peace, and you can detect a slight sense of relief in the German press at the time when it was found, that it was not found by a German. Now, as I said, Tony Clun had wanted to find gold coins. That's what he was after. He was a metal detectorist. But he realized fairly soon afterwards that he'd found a major battle. Not only did he find huge numbers of coins, he found huge varieties of military paraphernalia. If he had just found swords, then you could write it off as a raiding party. If he just found cavalry bits, similarly. But they found swords, they found daggers, they found spears, they found bolts from catapults. They found slingshots. It was the slingshots in particular that did so. But that's how the battle itself was found.
And before we go on debating, as I mentioned in the very beginning of the podcast, if this was a significant battle as it might have been for the Romans, I want to know, because in German, and we mentioned this briefly, he's also known as Hermann. So how did Arminius go to being Hermann?
Well, it's going to be the usual answer that I suspect you will be hating and never want to hear ever again. We don't know. Linguistically, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, it doesn't.
Other than they sound slightly similar.
I mean, I assume it must be something nationalistic, because Arminius was the Roman name, right? And then it must have been something there about nationalism in German that needed a more German name. Right, that must have been some parts that played in this.
The best guess is Arminius, and from Arminius you get to Hermann, the chieftain, and from Hermann to Hermann. Now it is massively debated. I suspect it's the simplest answer. That's probably how you get there. But it's certainly been sort of jumped on. I mean, it's a sign of how much consciousness is not just the number of Hermanns that there are in Germany, but the number of Arminiusstraßen that you see. I mean, there's barely, I can't think of a town where they have where you don't have at least one Arminiusstraße. So it's that's how it got in. So if that's kind of half answer. Yeah, I think the best guess is Arminius is the as you said, the Latinized version of Hermann, and Hermann to Hermann is the same.
So of course I want to end with I spoke about this before the podcast. How is it over exaggerated that the Battle of Teutoburg first? Because a lot of historians do claim that this was a stop for a Roman expansion into Germany, and that this would be, even though they tried and never conquered Germany, is it fair to say that this was truly the stop of Roman expansion into Germany, or is that an over-exaggeration?
Yes and no is the answer, as always. Yes, I think it is. The Romans never especially liked going over to the other side of the Rhine. And the Rhine, just physically by its nature, was a very handy barrier to have. Now it was very porous in the sense that there was a lot of trade that went back and forward. There is almost, I mean, you can't see a grave on north of the Rhine that doesn't have a huge amount of Roman gear. I mentioned geese before as that became Gans. Gans and Ganter, linguistically, you can see that coming from the Germans. There was a lot of trade in animals. There was also a lot of trade in wigs. German hair was prized. So there was a lot back and forward. And southern Germany, for want of a better word, saw a lot of sort of Roman expansion. I mean, Trier, for example, was a capital for a long time in the later Roman Empire. So yes, it stopped conquest, but there's a good argument to be made that the Romans didn't need to conquer any further. You know, they had it. They knew that they weren't going to see much trouble, and they got the stuff that they wanted.
And as you know, they never conquered. But yeah, I've debated this with someone before, and as you know, they never conquered Scandinavia or Germany or Ireland, and simply because for the Romans there was nothing there for them to, no interest in minerals. There was nothing there for them. So it could that be partly why as well that there was simply nothing interesting for the Romans to expand upon in Germany or Scandinavia for that matter. Could that be a reason as well?
Yes, I think it was. It is one of the very unpalatable arguments, and I say unpalatable because it's not popular at all in Scotland. That why the Romans made such an effort to conquer Scotland and then gave up.
They
Now,
built the wall because the Scottish people were bringing in drugs that brought in Irish people. They took their jobs, So
in reality, you're right. There's nothing there. It wasn't worth. History has fortunately changed in the last generation that we start to look at the money a lot more significantly, and it became in Germany as it did for Ireland, as it became for Scotland, as for Scandinavia. I'm sure that the Romans were saying, yes, we could, but it's not worth the effort. It would require a vast amount of manpower, and it would require a vast amount of money. And that is money, and that is soldiers that are better used closer to home for stuff where we know that there is an active benefit.
Did Germany simply become, if you want, was a general who needed, prestige and easy victory? Was that kind of, if you wanted the easy victory, where you wanted to go to Germany, right? Especially when Rome stopped expanding, was this the case?
Yes, yeah, there were various battles that continued into Germany throughout the Roman Empire, and you see almost a once in a generation, and your shoulders drop where you can see an emperor thinking, "I need to do something. I need to get my name on a coin." Celebrating a victory, I know I will send the army into. But that's pretty much as far as it went. That was also worth saying that Germania had a lot of legions looking after it. I mean, it was good 5 or 6 legions that were based up there. Indication that they were going to dismiss it slightly, and they weren't going to go in that way, but they were still going to take it seriously and not be caught again.
And I think we're gonna round it up there. And last year we made an episode with Lindsay Powell on Germanicus, who has written
Yes.
a biography on him, and we speak a lot about the aftermath after the Teutoburg first and Germanicus cleanup. As we mentioned, he kidnapped his wife and his son, and which Armenians will never see again. And but before you go, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Do you have anything you want to promote? Any links, any social media you want to share in the description?
No, thank you so much for having me. Follow me on Twitter.
I absolutely would recommend too. My name is Adrian. This has been Millet H12. We are available on Twitter and Instagram and Millet H12. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on iTunes, please consider writing a review of the podcast. That would help us out a lot. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.